Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Gunzinger, Director of Future Concepts and Capability Assessments at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Aerospace Nation Speakers Series, where we are pleased to host Major General Mark Weatherington today. General Weatherington is the commander of the 8th Air Force and the Joint Global Strike Operations Center, located at one of my favorite places, Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. The 8th Air Force is responsible for all the Air Force's bombers and airborne nuclear command and control assets, and the Joint GSOC is a central command and control node for Air Force Global Strike Command operations. General Weatherington previously served as a deputy commander of the Air Force's Air Education Training Command, as commander of the 28th Bomb Wing, which operates B-1 bombers, and in key positions in the Joint Staff and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So with command experience at the squadron, wing, and now the numbered Air Force level, General Weatherington is well qualified to lead the planning and execution of global strikes anywhere and at any time for our nation. Welcome, Mark, and thanks again for joining us. And I'd like to start by giving you the opportunity to share some of your thoughts on the Air Force's global strike mission in general, and some of the issues that the mighty 8th and Joint GSOC are dealing with today. So over to you.
Well, thanks, Mark. Good afternoon. And I want to start by thanking the Mitchell Institute and the Air Force Association for their intellectual leadership and persistent engagement of the public on a broad range of national security issues. And thanks for this opportunity to talk about 8th Air Force and the Joint Global Strike Operations Center, or JGSOC, and the contributions of our remarkable airmen to safeguard the United States of America and assure our allies through global strike on demand. I'd like to take a few minutes to describe my dual-hatted roles as the commander of 8th Air Force and as the commander of the Joint Global Strike Operations Center, and how those roles support U.S. Strategic Command as well as the geographic combatant commands. 8th runs like a typical NAF. We fall under Air Force Global Strike Command and perform the traditional service organize, train, and equip roles for more than 20,000 airmen in 5 Air Force Global Strike Bomber Wings and the 595th Command and Control Group. The command is comprised of a lean staff with an A1, several support agencies like protocol, financial management, public affairs, and safety. However, as the lead command operating bomber aircraft, the only allied bomber force, and the single bomber force provider, both nuclear and conventional, to all the combat commands, it's in my other hat as the JGSOC commander where we differ from the more familiar NAF and MAJCOM model. In 2017, then Commander General John Hyten streamlined U.S. STRATCOM to enable more effective command and control and to establish clear lines of authority. In this reorientation, General Hyten designated the Air Force Global Strike Command commander as the Commander Air Force's Strategic Air and as its Joint Force Air Component Commander, or JFAC. General Rand at the time, and now General Ray, opted to stand up and utilize a lean organization focused on the day-to-day execution of those JFAC responsibilities. The JGSOC, which would be augmented by the larger MAJCOM staff in times of crisis. The JGSOC includes an AFOR staff, so your typical A2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 functions. It also includes the 608th Air Operations Center that works with theater nodes to support bomber deployment and operations globally, the Joint Nuclear Operations Center that performs similar C2 and oversight functions for nuclear bomber and missile forces assigned to global strike, and the Standoff Munitions Applications Center, a one-of-a-kind planning and orchestrator of variety of standoff weapons capabilities for combat commands and other customers across the department, not just for the bomber forces. Whether generating Air Force capabilities for STRATCOM, monitoring and directing Air Force nuclear command and control activities, or sending a bomber task force to the Pacific, the JGSOC facilitates the traditional JFAC processes and ensures General Ray's guidance and intent inform operations. Now I'd like to focus on our bomber force and arm the listeners with some basic facts. Today's bomber force numbers 158 total aircraft, B-1s, B-2s, and B-52s, with an average age of more than 40 years. That's 40% the size of the bomber force when I entered the service, And even our newest bomber, the B-2, is approaching 20 years of service on average. An even smaller subset of that force is combat coded, a mere 96 bombers in 8 active duty combat squadrons. Like all of our warfighting capabilities, this force has strengths and weaknesses. And we have to persistently refine our operating concepts and develop new enabling technologies to stay ahead of potential adversaries. But I think most listeners would acknowledge the unique attributes of range, persistence, capacity, and flexibility that the bomber force offers. In some cases, particularly when it comes to our newest standoff weapons, and especially the unique capabilities of the B-2, no other warfighting entity can do what this force can do. And judging by the demand for bombers by our theater warfighters, we have a lot to offer. Since April of this year, we have been conducting a range of bomber task forces, or BTFs, of varying sizes, compositions, and durations to a wide range of locations, primarily in Europe and the Pacific. During this time, we have taken great precautions to prepare our airmen and preserve our capabilities in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. And this disciplined approach has enabled us to sustain a surge in bomber operations despite the pandemic. The Secretary of Defense and our combatant commanders have recognized these BTF efforts as absolutely vital to demonstrate our commitment to peace and stability and to assure our allies in a difficult time. Potential adversaries have noticed too. We've been unpredictable and kept them off balance. In fact, last Friday, B-52 bombers deployed to Fairford Air Base in the United Kingdom overflew 30 NATO nations to reinforce the strength of our partnership and to train with our partners. One of those bombers was intercepted in an unsafe and unprofessional manner by a pair of Russian fighters over international waters in the Black Sea. The Russian actions resulted in hazardous flight conditions and restricted the maneuverability of the jet. So yes, they've noticed. I'll wrap up my opening remarks by saying how proud I am to lead this incredibly talented group of airmen in the Mighty Eighth. This is an historic command, a command whose legendary efforts in World War II need little amplification, and our airmen today more than measure up to those proud generations that preceded them. They are smart, talented, and committed, and they aren't resting on their accomplishments. We have much to do to sustain the readiness of an aging fleet, to modernize the force, to develop and retain great airmen. These are imperatives as we confront the return to great power competition as described in the National Defense Strategy. Thanks again, Mark. Back to you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
General, excellent. Thank you very much for that context, and again, for all the 8th Air Force and Joint GSOC do every day to defend our great nation. So there's been quite a bit of press recently on bomber task force operations in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, as you said, and in other regions for that matter. Could you talk a little bit more about BTFs, what they are, their purpose, perhaps how you see them evolving over time?
Absolutely, Mark. Like other forces, our bombers have baseline commitments they support. An example would be the day-to-day strategic deterrence mission they perform on behalf of U.S. Strategic Command. They also have theater war plan commitments. At the same time, bomber forces have service-level responsibilities to train and prepare and to build readiness. Over time, the processes that govern these activities, that matched forces to our highest priorities, that responded to emerging crises, and that sought to balance readiness and presence, became less agile and flexible, often misaligned with the strategic context we faced. We were too predictable, too plodding, and too inflexible. And in a small bomber force, we became fundamentally imbalanced in favor of presence over readiness. Over the last several years, leaders in the Department of Defense sought to reorient these processes. One of the key changes was transitioning to a dynamic force employment model, or DFE. The Bomber Task Force is how we bring DFE to life in Global Strike Command. As I mentioned earlier, for the last 5 months, we have been regularly conducting theater security cooperation with allies and partners, providing theater presence, gaining awareness of different operating areas and bases, and honing our skills in all of our mission sets through bomber task forces. These individually tailored bomber force packages have ranged from multi-aircraft CONUS-to-CONUS missions, approaching 40 hours in duration, to 3 to 6 aircraft deployments to forward operating locations for several weeks. Importantly, We've seen bomber readiness indicators for both our people and our fleets climb, despite the concurrent negative impacts of the pandemic. And in contrast to our previous approach, which was a much more static and much more limited in scope, we've been able to provide bomber capabilities to multiple theater combatant commanders to satisfy their most important objectives. I have to give a shout out here to the theater AOCs and planning staffs, and especially to Air Mobility Command and their spectacular air refueling and airlift teams who enable every one of these operations. BTFs are a team sport, and one of the strengths we enjoy is the world's greatest air mobility team. As far as how BTFs will evolve, we are engaged with theater teams and AMC to better understand their needs and refine how we do this. The balance of CONUS to CONUS and deployment missions may change slightly. We may see some new and different operating locations, and we are starting to better leverage some of our reserve component capabilities in bomber task forces. The next graduate level step is to better integrate BTF with other theater activities, other warfighting capabilities in a way that enhances their contribution. Overall, I think BTFs have been hugely successful. Our ops and maintenance teams like this approach, and we're getting great feedback from the theaters.
Thank you, and great feedback from our allies and friends too. So, General, you mentioned total active inventory of 158 bombers, 96 combat coded. Well, we released a report a few months ago that forecast that number could go down before it begins to go up. And by down, I mean you could soon hit 125 total bombers or so, B1s, B-52s, and B-2s, before the B-21 begins to join the force in significant numbers. So that would be the smallest U.S. bomber force since the year 1940. So from your vantage point, how small do you think the bomber force will become before B-21s land on the ramp? And more importantly, what are your thoughts on the strategic impact of this kind of shrinkage and the kind of shrinkage we've seen since the end of the Cold War, for that matter?
You bet. Mark, I can't give you an exact number. I think there will need to be some flexibility as we see how B-21 comes online, how the global security context changes, and how budgets and other factors play into the mix. However, I do think we'll see periods in the next 10 to 15 years where the force gets smaller before it starts to grow, and that does concern me. As I mentioned earlier, 96 combat-coded bombers is not a lot when you look at bomber utilization in our plans and the day-to-day demand signal we get from the theaters. Currently, 8 active-duty bomber squadrons makes predictable, sustainable deployment of our crews and maintainers a challenge. The Mitchell Institute report does a great job characterizing the challenge and advocating for a larger bomber force. I think it's the 5th report in the last few years that calls for a bomber force of between 220 and 250 or 270 bombers. But it's not just the overall numbers. Our bomber forces today are 3 small fleets, which makes sustainment and support more costly and challenging. Replacing the smaller B1 and B2 fleets with the larger B21 fleet will help immensely in this regard. As for the strategic impact, I recognize that it's fundamentally about the entire range of capabilities, not just Air Force capabilities and not just a bomber force. However, I know how well the bomber force complements the other elements of our warfighting capability, and I see how potential adversaries react to bomber deployments and operations. In periods where we do have reduced capacity, we will need to be more deliberate in our prioritization of activities, and we'll need to identify ways to cover down on the diminished capacity using other warfighting capabilities. I also think as we discuss the flow of the bomber force and we learn how B-21 will come online, there will be opportunities to make decisions to either accelerate or to extend or to adjust the flow of aircraft as that security context changes. And I think we need to be open to making those adjustments as they develop.
Thank you. I had the great pleasure of visiting Barksdale Air Force Base, 8th Air Force, a couple of years ago. And at the time, there was talk about redoing the bomber vector. So we know that the bomber force is going to change dramatically over the next 20 years as it's modernized and grows in size to meet requirements of the National Defense Strategy. Would you address some of those changes, perhaps including the Air Force's plan to transition to a force that includes at least 100 B-21 stealth bombers?
Absolutely. And these are big changes, as you mentioned, especially when we realize the 100 or more B-21 bombers in the fleet. Your bomber force will become one that is 2/3 or more low observable from one that is only 20% LO today. That's a big change. It affects how we plan and integrate, how we operate, the facilities we use, everything. And spreading that enterprise across multiple bases instead of just one base currently at Whiteman will force us to organize and operate differently than we do now. It will fundamentally impact how we integrate with allies and partners as well. Among some of the benefits of transitioning and going to 2 platforms will be efficiencies with fewer training units, fewer test and weapons school detachments, for example, so maybe some more efficient use of the manpower. But among the biggest changes, and one we're already looking at, the transition will dramatically reshape the crew force. We'll see numbers decline initially, but then we'll need more pilots. We'll have to find a way to transition a significant number of weapon system officers from the B-1. That's one reason we worked with the ATC to put a couple of B-1 WISOs into the Pilot Training Next program last year as a pathfinder to understand how we do this smartly, how we best leverage the incredible talents in this force. We'll continue to work this force transition aggressively with the Global Strike Team in the next few years.
Okay, thank you, General. So one question on bomber size, if you don't mind. Very related. We heard the current target is to grow to approximately 225 total bombers, but that number has been fairly fluid. And of course, in the future, that force will consist of B-52s and B-21s as the Air Force faces its B-2s and B-1s out of inventory. So that's still just a bit more than half the size of the bomber force. It was actually on the ramp around 1989, the end of the Cold War period. Given increasing operational demand for bombers, the shift toward competing with other great powers and, of course, defeating great power aggression if necessary, could you see that target eventually growing beyond 225?
Great question, Mark. And I think I've hit this a little bit already, but certainly General Goldfein, before he departed, opened the door to a larger B-21 force. And as I mentioned, there have been several studies suggesting the force is inadequately sized and needs to grow. What I do know is that our plans and strategies that we put in place are often wrong. Over time, it's going to play out, and there'll be some unanticipated or unexpected context, some challenges we face. So it's hard to say whether 225 is the right number or not from my chair right now. There certainly are other courses of action, different mixes of capability that could be employed. And given the capabilities we expect from a modernized force and the cost, I don't think we need to build the 744 B-21s. That's the number of B-52s we built way back in the 50s and 60s. But I would say my sense is the current force is too small to meet all the demands we place on it. Air Force Global Strike Command is building decision points into that B-21 ramp, into that effort that would permit growth if required. And I think we'll have to seriously look at it as we get farther down the stream of bringing B-21s online. It'll be a national debate informed by deep analysis, I'm sure, within the department and even outside. And I guarantee you, 8th Air Force will work relentlessly to ensure whatever the size of the force, we're ready and capable.
Thank you, Weather. I'll tell you, if you do, Air Force does buy 700 plus B-21s. Everyone at Mitchell Institute will instantly volunteer to come back and help crew them.
Excellent.
Just saying. Speaking of the B-21, by all accounts, the program is doing great, and there's even been talk about accelerating its production. General Goldfein, before he departed, said that he thought the Air Force could get more B-21s on their ramp faster, perhaps not sooner, but faster. So from a warfighter perspective, is there a requirement or operational demand for increasing the B-21's production rate?
Right now, everybody's watching B-21. And as you mentioned, the program is in excellent shape and on track. However, like any program, I think we'll anticipate some hurdles as we complete development and begin to field the jet. And we'll evaluate the different opportunities and choices that arise. In the meantime, our current force remains extremely capable, However, we have to adapt. For example, you've seen a shift to a greater reliance on standoff weapons in some of the most challenging scenarios. If we view this through the lens of competition, through potential Sorry, thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that outstanding demonstration of the effectiveness of operating in stealth mode. That's pretty good.
Absolutely. I hope I didn't embarrass myself.
Not at all. Things happen. So for the sake of time, I'll press on to the next question. A little bit on B-52H modernization, my old aircraft, which are projected to remain in the force through the year 2040, at least, I guess. The Air Force intends to upgrade its remaining B-52s with new engines, radars, comm systems, and other systems. Would you discuss progress on those upgrades and why they're needed at this point in time in the B-52's life cycle?
You bet, Mark. Absolutely amazing that the Buff is going to remain with us as a significant contributor to the fight in 2040 and even beyond. Despite being our oldest bomber by a significant margin, it has the most life remaining among the B-1, B-2, and B-52. However, continuing to effectively compete against modern adversaries will require some improvements, and the Global Strike 5-8 team here is driving on these hard. Probably the most critical is the Commercial Engine Replacement Program, or CERP. Engine reliability and parts availability pose the most significant sustainment challenge to the fleet today. And we know this program will deliver significant cost savings with reduced maintenance, and will also reduce the number of tankers that we require when we employ. We anticipate about a 30% fuel savings through this program and increased reliability to equate to much less maintenance downtime. So that's on track. Funds are good, and we expect to see a lot of good work there, and probably 30 to 40 engine refurbs a year that we'll see it play out over the life cycle of the airplane. Similarly, a radar modernization program, or RMP, is essential to replace the now unsupportable radar and dramatically improve performance and supportability. We anticipate about $377 million in savings on sustainment costs alone compared to the legacy system, and RMP is also funded and a supplier has been selected. We've also got 25 B-52s that have already received a full intermediate weapons bay upgrade, with others in various stages of the upgrade that increases smart weapon capacity by about 67%. And that's akin to adding 20 more aircraft to the fleet. This upgrade also adds mission flexibility and can permit more efficient weapons configurations. And finally, we have a couple of vital communication upgrades in work. 70 of 76 B-52s have already received the Connect upgrade that improves the platform's data link capability and supports rapid retargeting. And we're starting to work on low frequency and very low frequency radio replacement program that supports the nuclear mission. So overall, for an old workhorse, it's getting the upgrades it needs to be effective into the 2040s and into 2050.
Outstanding. So we've talked about the B-21 and B-52. How about a little bit on the B-1, specifically its readiness, which, as we all know, has declined significantly due to the high operational tempo and stresses placed on the airframes because of how they are operated during missions over Afghanistan and elsewhere. So could you give us a short update on status repairs to the B-1 fleet and its overall readiness, please?
You bet. You know, the B-1's been a workhorse for the last 20 years, as you mentioned. It's filled a critical need in the counterinsurgency fight, but we broke it hard, and we were forced to take an operational reset and to adjust flight profiles to extend the service life of the jet. And we've already seen some paybacks in readiness and fleet health improvements in the year and a half since the reset began. And we even recently began to utilize the B-1 to fill BTF requirements. That being said, we're still working with AFMC and others to fully characterize the structural life of the airframe and to determine what significant repairs must be accomplished. And though we do not plan to close any B-1 squadrons or significantly reduce manpower, the Air Force proposed retiring 17 of the most structurally deficient aircraft in the coming year. We think some of these savings in dollars and resources will help ensure the remaining fleet is more capable and able to bridge the bomber force to the B-21.
Excellent. So let's cast our net a little more broadly. In addition to investments the Air Force plans to make in long-range strike, the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps are going to fund some programs for new long-range strike standoff systems. So this is a whole from a DoD perspective. Is it possible that the services may be over-investing in standoff strike capabilities? And frankly, some capabilities that could result in higher costs to kill a target, compared to less expensive weapons that can be delivered by bombers. Do you think there's a need for a joint analysis of the most cost-effective means of long-range strikes to make sure that DoD has a balanced portfolio and is maximizing, frankly, bang for its investments?
You know, Mark, I'm not surprised, given the capabilities that near-peer adversaries possess and are developing, that all the services are looking for ways to influence warfighting outcomes from a greater range. And to some degree, this kind of exploration and diversity in capabilities is vital to building a suite of capabilities we'll need to compete more effectively in the future. But the department should absolutely conduct some sort of joint analysis of different long-range strike capabilities. Some redundancy absolutely may be needed. Some differentiation is essential. But the true strength of our force since Desert Storm has been our ability to synchronize and leverage the best warfighting capabilities resident among all the services. As you mentioned, I think the strength of our bomber force, range, flexibility, cost per effect, its inherent strategic mobility will play well in any analysis. And I think we've already started to move a little bit in global strike to look at some options that are available there, to look at Aero and what that brings to the fight in terms of a early hypersonic capability that the department could have that we think is ahead of the game right now. And we're looking at what we can do on the B-52 as well as the B-1 to provide that capability to the department sooner.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate your mention of the term cost per effect, because that is the foundation, I believe, where we should, the beginning point for how we look at these capabilities. So given the other services had to invest in new long strike systems, all of which will be standoff strike capabilities, would it make sense for the Air Force to focus on long-range penetrating strikes, a mission that only it can really do? In other words, is there really a need for the Air Force to invest in new standoff strike aircraft?
Mark, I don't think the answer is one or the other. It's more about balance. Certainly, like the B-2 today, the B-21 is intended to be able to stand in and hit heavily defended targets with special purpose weapons that we can't strike from a distance or using another means. And I think this is a consistent strand in the DNA of our Air Force from the earliest days. However, standoff capabilities from our bombers and our other air-breathing platforms will remain an important component of any strategy. As you mentioned earlier, inherent strengths of our bomber force when coupled with standoff weapons capabilities will be a formidable component of future operations and one that our adversaries will have to take into account.
Okay, thank you, General. A couple of questions on future nuclear capabilities related to our triad. First, philosophically, some people have said that a dual capable platform, conventional and nuclear capable platform, such as a bomber, should be used for conventional missions against a nuclear armed opponent, such as China or Russia, because that could be very escalatory. On the other hand, we've had conventional nuclear variants of cruise missiles and dual capable aircraft for decades. So what is your perspective as a warfighter on that issue?
You know, Mark, sometimes I think we get trapped in these intense theoretical debates that focus on very specific and very limited aspects of a problem, and all too often at a policy level of abstraction that kind of obscures the real details that matter. This is why we maintain the complementary capabilities of the triad, the balance of forces and capabilities that work together to deter a nuclear attack. Our adversaries do the same. We message intentions, and like our adversaries, we monitor a lot of the telltale signs that help remove some of the ambiguity, especially at the scale of operations that would be required to conduct a successful first strike. Bombers are and will be the flexible, visible second strike capability in our arsenal. I think they're, by that nature, very stability enhancing. I'd argue that in the manner they are used, They provide a great hedge against unanticipated challenges in the triad, especially as we modernize the entire triad at one time. And you know, our near peer adversaries, who, by the way, possess the same kinds of weapon systems, do not appear to be as outwardly constrained by this kind of thinking. In fact, they seem to embrace ambiguity across a wide range of military activities, from little green men to cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, right? And they continue to develop and refine these dual purpose platforms and weapons. I'm sure they would be delighted with a policy decision that limited our conventional bomber capabilities. And I'll add one more thing. As we look at this problem, this is not new, right? Bombers carrying cruise missiles, bombers that are both conventional and nuclear, have been employed for decades, have been something that's has been part of our adversaries' calculus, as well as our calculus. And I don't think that when we look at it on a very small theoretical scale, we really capture the practical realities of what's going on.
Weather, I think you actually answered the next question I was going to ask, and that is about the long-range standoff weapon, or LRSO as it's called, which will be replacing the Outcomes air-launched cruise missiles that were designed in the 1970s to be carried by B-52s. And there are some that have called for the LRSO's cancellation, claiming that, again, it would be help to stabilize a nuclear deterrence. I think you answered that, but if you'd like to add to your thoughts on that, feel free. But part two of that is, what's potential to accelerate the LRSO's development and production? And what would be some of the benefits from replacing those aging Outcomes a little bit sooner?
Yeah, well, I think you hit it spot on. I won't spend a lot of time on the deterrence aspects of it. I do think you're right. This is not a new capability. It is a replacement for an existing weapon system that's helped maintain stability and deterrence for 30 years. And so from that respect, I don't think it really changes the stability equation or the balance between us and our adversaries that much. It does ensure that we have a viable capability that's been a benefit to us for 30 years and will continue to set that stage and maintain a stable deterrent. I think cruise missiles are also a widely proliferated weapon system, widely used by allies and adversaries alike. And I think a delay would introduce a lot of challenges as we modernize the entire fleet. I do think as we've looked at it, the sole source decision in April provided an opportunity to accelerate maybe some of the milestones, milestone B, C, and IOC, or initial operating capability, by about a year each. And so I know Global Strike is watching carefully as this program develops and will look for opportunities to perhaps accelerate it. We've got good funding and I think a lot of support for this program going forward.
Hey, thank you. Thanks again for your time and insights. Now, I understand you may not have the luxury, General, but we'd like to ask if your permits, could we perhaps add another 5 to 10 minutes to this session so we can address some more of the questions from our listeners?
Absolutely. If Mike will make it happen.
Okay, excellent. So I'll wrap up. The Mighty Eighth and JGSOC are really the tip of the spear, in the sense that the missions you perform every day are critical to deterring threats, assuring Americans' friends, and remaining prepared to fight on night one of a conflict anywhere in the world. No other force in our nation's military can do what you and your commands do. So on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and all of AFA, thank you. Just as a quick reminder before we open it to questions, the next Mitchell event is going to be this Wednesday, September 2nd at 10 a.m. And as part of our Nuclear Deterrence Forum, we'll host Dr. Rob Suford, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. And he was a key architect for the most recent Nuclear Posture Review and Missile Defense Review. So we're now going to open this session to questions from the audience. And as a reminder, please, to our audience, you can participate by using the raise hand function, and we will go ahead and call on you. And we do have some great questions lined up. I'm sure we'll start with Michael Gordon from the Wall Street Journal. Michael?
Sir, I'd like to ask you a couple of just quick follow-ups on the points that Mark's already raised with you. First, can you tell us when you expect the B-21 to enter the force, what the IOC might be, approximately, recognizing it might not be known with certainty, and what the IOC what would constitute an IOC, how many aircraft that would be? Second, you mentioned on B-52 modernization, it seems like a cost-effective thing to do, given you already have the airframe, but given you're replacing the engines, radars, bomb bay. What do you think the approximate cost of that modernization might be? I mean, it's not free. And then lastly, there's been some discussion about a so-called arsenal plane. Why would we need an arsenal plane? Isn't the B-52 the arsenal plane?
Those are all great questions, and I may have to dig through some notes to get you a precise number. But let me start with I'll kind of work backwards. Let me start with the arsenal plane. Obviously that's been a long time discussion. It was even I think proposed 80 years ago that type of capability might be something we should look at. And it's been interesting over the last decade or so. People have talked about why can't we adapt a wide-body commercial airliner and quickly make that into an arsenal plane of some sort. There's challenges in doing that and how aircraft are designed. And I think when you do the analysis, you find that it's actually cheaper and more effective to purpose build an airplane that does all of this. And as you alluded to, in a lot of ways, the B-52 is right now an arsenal plane. I think if you look at our B-1 and the capabilities that it has and what it brings to the fight, it's very similar to what we would be able to do in that way. So interesting concept. I think if there was a way to rapidly and easily convert some type of a commercial platform to deliver a scale of weapons, that would be a neat route to go. I think we've also had some discussion on palletized munitions recently that have come up, which is interesting. I think we view those as additive, right, to bring to the fight. I think the first question I would ask anybody, if they said, hey, palletized weapons is the answer, I'd ask them how much excess airlift capacity they think we have. Because you're now going to compete with moving people and equipment and machines and all sorts of things with an airlift fleet that you're going to have to do in a crisis anyway. You may not have all that excess airlift you think to do all the arsenal or delivery of those palletized types of munitions. So an interesting additive capability and something to watch. As far as B-52 modernization, I'll dig through here and see if I can get you an exact number. I think it's on the order of $3.5 million a copy. And so when the B-52, we bought them about $7 million a piece. To go out now and to buy that type of capability certainly would be much more cost prohibitive. And so that's what we think the answer is. And I think we've got a good road ahead. And I think we see how the money that we spend will be able to bring back in terms of savings. And so I think we got a very viable way ahead, and the folks that have the purse strings have been agreeing with us so far. And then on B-21 IOC, I'm not sure if I can give you an IOC date just yet. I think what I could tell you is we expect a first flight somewhere in 22 is what we'll say, no earlier than 22, I would say. And we'll see that move on there. I think a lot depends on, as Mark asked earlier, whether we decide to bring them on a little bit faster, not sooner, but faster, so a steeper ramp. If we get a steeper ramp, I think you'll see an earlier IOC date. And then I really would say 10 years. Think about this as a decade, 10 to 12 years type of challenge as we look to be in that IOC, FOC range and retiring B2s and B1s and bringing on a fully capable B21. So I don't think that hits the exact answer you're looking for, but that's the best I got for you right now.
Thank you, Michael. Now on to Patrick Host from James. Next question.
Hey, sir, were you part of this bomber task force exercise in the Pacific a few weeks ago?
I was, and I wish I was. So some neat activity there. We brought together several streams of task forces. So not just one, but multiple types of aircraft. And we've been helping the Pacific out quite a bit. And so if you follow how this really evolved, you know, we were doing continuous bomber presence missions out of Guam for many years. And the Secretary of Defense looked at the readiness capability of the bomber fleet, where we stood, and looked at some alternatives to put Bomber Task Force in place. And I think we've continued to provide the Pacific with some incredible capability, while we're also helping Europe and the other theaters as well.
Well, I was going to ask if you could perhaps give us some insight into the strategy with this exercise, perhaps why you picked the aircraft you did, or if there were any missions you specifically wanted to exercise.
Yeah, I think, well, what I would tell you is broadly, we provide forces to the combatant command. And so you really have to ask the EUCOM commander and the PACOM commander, and we've done some for NORTHCOM as well, and we do some cross command stuff with AFRICOM and Central Command as well. You know, they're the ones who come up with the objectives, to come up with the activity, and they nominate those. They all come forward, the request for forces. We look at the capacity we have and what we can provide to the theaters and how to orchestrate that. And they're really the drivers. So I know they have theater security cooperation objectives they go after. They have objectives that they might go after to influence a potential adversary, to work with a partner, to build capability, and to just demonstrate some capabilities as well. So while we're involved in that conversation, it's more from a standpoint of understanding what those theater priorities are and what resources we can put against them to support.
Thanks.
You bet.
Okay, let's go to our very own John Turpak, Air Force Magazine.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
You can.
Very good. Good afternoon, General. Thanks very much. I'd like you to, if you could, put into perspective for us the hypersonic weapons. If you recall, back in the 90s, the first efforts with a GPS weapon was the GATM, and then we quickly superseded that and went on to the JDAM. I'm wondering if Arrow is the same kind of thing. It's something to get us in the game quickly, and then we'll be superseded by the Mayhem, the air-breathing system. So if you could walk us through how you see the hypersonic weapons joining the force. Are there particular ones that are going with particular platforms, like are some for B-52, some for the B-21, et cetera, and try to give us an idea of where Global Strike is headed with hypersonics.
You bet. And I think, John, I talked a little bit about this earlier with Arrow. I think you're right. I think we're going to see a range of capabilities. Obviously, there are competing systems out there right now, and I think everybody's competing for the dollars that might be in this hypersonic capability area. But I think we will see kind of an uneven development. We'll see some systems that are early to the fight. Arrow may be one of those, right, to demonstrate some capability. And that's actually a good thing, because part of this whole development process, we also have to refine our concepts of operation, right? How are we going to employ hypersonic weapons? What do they bring to the battlefield? What are our considerations for planning and executing and integrating them in a fight? And so all of that develops kind of unevenly over time. But I do think you'll see some early entries into that fight. And then I think we'll refine how we do things, what we like, what we don't like, where there's more promising technology that comes along. And then you'll probably see that list of competing platforms get a little bit smaller. I also think you're right on from a perspective of there's probably room for a range of weapons. If you're talking something really large, it's probably going to be on a bomber aircraft. But you're also going to want to develop some that are a little bit smaller, that are hypersonic, maybe less range, maybe less payload with them, but can be carried on bomber or a fighter type of aircraft as well. And so I think you'll see that mix. I think the really interesting thing that we have to work through is hypersonic weapons, still have the information age demands. You know, how do we understand the target, where it's at, where it may be going, make sure we can close that kill chain on a particular target. How do we provide updates if there is a longer time of flight, even though it's hypersonic? So there's a lot of things like that that we'll have to work through, that we've had to work through with other standoff types of weapons.
Okay, so you're not viewing the Arrow as kind of a temporary or a stopgap. It's something that you think you're going to bring into the inventory for the long haul.
Mark or John, I don't know if I'd say that. I think right now we're learning. I think the Arrow is going to give us that first opportunity to learn. I think I'd have to go ask some experts at AFRL and try to understand, you know, what their perspective on how the technology is lining out right now. It's not something that I follow every day, and I know it's rapidly changing. And so, you know, I don't think I'd have the best answer for you on whether Arrow's around for the long haul or whether it's just a short-term answer.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And General, as you pointed out, I completely agree with the need to develop new operating concepts for hypersonic strikes as well as that technology. So let's go a little further afield with Sagman Lee from Radio Free Asia. General, can you tell me what the strategy of nuclear extended deterrence is, especially in the Korean Peninsula, what it is after the new strategy called dynamic force employment was implemented, especially in terms of bombers, B-52s, B-1s, and B-2s?
Yeah, I don't want to mix apples and oranges here. I think I'll pick that apart a little bit on extended deterrence. When I think of extended deterrence, I think of a way we support allies and partners and provide them deterrence from, you know, based on our strategic capabilities as a means of assuring them, as a means of preventing a wider arms race or proliferation of some WMD capabilities. But we still got to be there to back them up and provide that extended deterrence capability. I would separate that from dynamic force employment. DFE to me is much more of a conventional capability. How do we employ forces? How do we use our forces in a way that's strategically predictable for us, but operationally unpredictable for the adversary, that gives them a new challenge to look at, that makes them have to work through a problem of little pockets of force that move around, that aren't static, that cause them to have to think and react differently. And that's really what dynamic force employment is bringing to the fight, giving us a chance to be more agile, more flexible, and employ forces in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Now to Frank Wolf. Thank you for your patience. Defense Daily. Frank?
Oh, yeah. Hi, General. Appreciate the time. I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit. If you went out to Palmdale to view the B21 production, and just sort of your views on it and challenges going forward, and any kind of insight you may have into the avionics testbed aircraft, which is they're obviously avionics and other things that they're looking at, and what you see as sort of the challenges in the program going forward.
Yeah, Frank, I made this point. You haven't been out there yet, and we are planning a visit. But with the pandemic going on, travel's been a little bit haphazard so far. But what I do know from talking to folks, from discussing the program, and from getting some perspectives on folks who have been out there, is that things are going really well. And so far we think that program is on track. It's coming in under or at the unit costs that we thought it would come in at, which is great. And we think it's going to deliver capabilities because we've got a strong set of requirements that underpin it. And so everything I hear is positive. I'm looking forward to getting out there and seeing it. I think, like anything though, especially today, the avionics, the communications, that backbone that's going to provide information, that's going to share information, that's going to connect to other systems. Those are absolutely vital capabilities. I think we all know that B21 is going to bring some unique characteristics in terms of its low observable capabilities, in terms of its weapons, and all of those things. But it's those other capabilities that are very complex, and that we've developed over the last several years. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. I'll tell you another thing that I'm absolutely interested in is the training and crew force kind of integration with the jet. How do we prepare people to fly it? How do they understand and learn as they're flying? How do we debrief? How do we give them ready access to information to help them improve and become stronger, become better? And so I am headed down to Melbourne to just talk to the team about some of the training systems and debrief capabilities and other aspects of the platform that are really important to the crew force going forward. I mean, that's how we're going to build and train the best operators in the B21 we could possibly have.
Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, I have two questions from write-ins, and then we'll wrap it up, General. Again,
Okay.
for your time hanging around with us. So, what advanced command and control capabilities do you need to support your missions in the future? And that is from Kimberly Underwood, Signal Magazine. I'll add to that in the context of what other services are doing in the arena of long-range strike as well. Command and control of not just stand-in, but standoff capabilities from all the services.
You bet. That's a great question. I appreciate it, Kimberly. I think, the only way to answer this, right, is to channel our former chief and actually the current chief and a lot of leaders who are talking about joint all-domain command and control. How do we integrate these exquisite weapon systems, different capabilities from across the different services with our partner nations in a way that allows them to all be optimized and take advantage of all their different strengths and what they bring to the fight. And so, I don't know if I have specific capabilities I talk to you about. Certainly in a B21 type of environment, we're looking at kind of low probability of intercept and detection types of things, the ability to communicate and to share information with a platform that's really intended not to be seen or to be found, right? Those are difficult problems to solve. And then sharing that information with our other generations of platforms with maybe not that same level of protection, right? So I think that those are the big challenges. It's getting information to be exchanged between systems that were built in different stovepipes, and look at our current problem within the command. We've got an airframe that's a B-52 that's 60 years old, that's going to be around for 80 years or more. And we're talking about how do we integrate that with a platform that's going to be brand new coming off the line about that time. And so there's certainly a huge challenge to make those things interact and integrate well.
Okay, thank you. Last question. It's a question regarding the 8th Air Force's training and resourcing for the Maritime strike mission, including employment of LRSOs, quick strike mines, and other munitions, and what do you anticipate there'll be increased emphasis on maritime strike mission given the national defense strategy focus on China and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great topic to discuss. I think certainly as we look at China in particular, but don't discount the other adversaries as well. Naval capabilities, maritime capabilities are an important aspect of what they bring to the fight now, right? And certainly in the Pacific, that is a maritime fight in a lot of ways. And so I think our bomber force has some incredible strengths that they can bring to that fight in terms of capacity, range, flexibility, some of the information exchange types of capabilities that we'll bring. You look at LRSO and what that means to a force that hasn't had that kind of an air to surface or air to ship type of capability for many years. I think that's really important and will become a game changer in a lot of ways as we look at how we plan and prepare for potential engagements in that area. On the mining side of things, I think there's still some questions in my mind that we'll have to work through. It's a unique capability, but it's a challenge when you look at what it operationally takes to employ a minefield, and maybe some of the limitations from a law of war type of standpoint, and just the willingness of an adversary to watch that happen. You know, when is it really going to be applicable in an operational scenario? And so there's probably some times where it'll be useful, but I think we'll have to weigh that with other capabilities and other potential uses of our weapon systems that are out there. And like I said, I think this is an important area, and I think it'll be a growth area for the command in the coming years.
Excellent. Great to hear. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this segment of our Aerospace Nation series, a conversation with Major General Mark Weatherington, Commander of the 8th Air Force and the Joint Global Strike Operations Center. General, our sincere thanks and best wishes for all of us in the Mitchell Institute, and to you and our audience, have a global strike kind of day. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.